Hi everybody. Okay, so in this video today we are going to be looking at the start of the Reformation, and we're going to be having a look at the church under Henry VIII. Okay, so we're going to cover what the Reformation was, why Henry VIII wanted to reform the church, and then what he got out of it. And then in the coming videos, we're going to have a look at each of the different Tudor monarchs and how they either stayed with what Henry VIII had started or changed the church back. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the effect that the changes have on the people at the time as well. So let's get going then on Henry and the Reformation. Okay, now if you've not heard of the Reformation before, or you want a little refresher on what it is, a really good way of thinking about the Reformation is to think about the word itself. Okay, so if we take the word and we break it down, the main bit that we need to look at is the word reform. Now, reform means remake. Okay, so we're remaking the church, we're making it into something slightly different than what it was before. So Henry reformed the church, and that's where we get the word Reformation from. Okay, so if you're struggling to remember what it means, just remember the first bit of the word, which is reform, which literally means to remake something. Okay, so if we're reforming the church, what are we changing it from? Now, up until this point in history, up until 1517, where a man called Martin Luther, not to be confused with Martin Luther King, two very different people, Martin Luther was a German, and he came up with this idea of a different church to the Catholic Church. Now, everybody in England up until this point, if you were English, you were Catholic. And this idea of breaking away from the church was really, really radical, and people believed so highly in heaven and hell, and the church had always been run by the Pope, not by the king. They believed that that God appointed the king to rule the country. However, in terms of rank in religion, it was God, the Pope, the king. Okay, now Henry VIII had a problem with this, with the way that that made his power lesser than the Pope, and which we'll come on to in a minute. But the Catholic Church was what everybody had always followed. Okay, so the idea of changing this church to a lot of people just would not have ever occurred to them, because that's the way that they worshipped, and they would have believed that if they didn't worship the Catholic Church, then they may end up in hell. Okay, so you've got to think of and realize sort of the control that the church had on people's lives, because the church could say, right, give us your money, because if you give money to the church, you're more likely to go to heaven, you're more likely to go to hell if you don't follow the church, if you don't come to church every week. So people were extremely religious, because they believed that their time on earth would influence their afterlife, which was actually more important. So a lot of people, if they had anything left when they died, would leave their belongings to the church in their will to try and get them into heaven. And it had a really big impact on people's lives. So before we start having a look at Henry's motives, just make sure that we're aware of what the difference is between Protestantism and Catholicism is. Okay, so in the Protestant faith, the Bible is in your own language, which in our case, looking at Henry, would be English. Okay, so this is a big difference. The Bible in the Protestant religion is in the language of the people, which means that the people can read the Bible and interpret it for themselves. Okay, they can read it, they can understand it. However, in Catholicism, the Bible is in Latin. So if you're going to a Catholic church service and you're looking at the Bible, chances are you might not be able to understand it. Now, the average person in this time couldn't read and write anyway, so you might not have been able to read it in English, but you might have been able to understand it. Chances of people, the average Joe, reading and writing and understanding Latin was far slimmer than even English. Okay, so that's a key difference. In Protestantism, everything seems to be a lot more simple for the Protestants. So the plain, simple clothes for priests. In Catholicism, they had expensive, highly decorated vestments, which was the outfits that the priests wore. The rulers of countries should be the head of the church. Okay, so the rulers of countries, so in our case, we have the monarch. I'm not going to use the word king because, as we'll see in later videos, it's not necessarily always the king. For the purpose of this video, it's Henry. So Henry should be the head of the church, not the Pope. Okay, the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. Bread and wine are symbolic of Christ's body and blood in Protestantism, and in Catholicism, bread and wine are miraculously transformed in the service called the Mass. So the Catholics believed that when you went to the front of the church and you drank the wine and you ate the wafer, that would turn into the body of Christ. The Protestants thought that that was just a symbol. It wasn't literal, it didn't actually happen. Ordinary people do not need bishops or cardinals or to find God or priests, so you could pray directly to God. However, in Catholicism, you would pray to somebody and they would take your message to God. In Protestantism, services and churches are simple. So there's no crosses, there's no candles, there's no paintings, there's no sort of decoration, there's no stained glass windows in Protestant churches. They are extremely simple because the idea was it was you communicating directly with God. You didn't need all these fancy things to help you. However, in Catholicism, chalices, gold plates, crucifixes, and powerful images give the church a sense of mystery. In Protestantism, believing in Christ is more important than elaborate service. However, in Catholicism, services like the Mass leave ordinary people with a sense of awe for the church. So that means that they're in wonder of it. They can't believe what they're seeing. Now, I'm just going to highlight a few things on the Catholic side to see if we can sort of build up an image of why Henry might be so interested in the Catholic Church. Okay, so highly decorated, expensive, and then we've got gold plate, and then we've got the word awe, right? So all of these things show that the Catholic Church needs a lot of money, right? And if the Pope is the head of that church, the money is going to Rome because that's where the Pope is and that's where the head of the church is. So when people go to church and they give donations, all that money, all of the land that the church owned is actually owned by the Pope in Rome. So Henry being the King of England, we can sort of see why he might have had a problem with that. Okay, so Henry decides to adopt the Protestant religion, which makes him the head of the church. It means he inherits the wealth of the church, and it means that he gets a lot more power. He doesn't have to answer to anybody else. He gets to have the power to himself. Okay, so a little bit about Henry VIII then. He's the son of Henry VII, first Tudor monarch. It had been expected that he would have had just an important position in the church. He wasn't actually the heir to the throne. He had a brother called Arthur, and Arthur dies very young, and Henry actually marries his widow, Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish king. Okay, he was a religious man. Now, this is something important to remember about Henry. Okay, he is religious, he does attend Mass, and at this point, his religion is Catholicism. Okay, he's a Catholic and he worshipped as a Catholic. Okay, so he wrote a book defending the Catholic Church, and the Pope actually called him the defender of the faith. So all of the things we can see about Henry growing up, we might think, well, this sounds really bizarre. Why on earth is he going to become a Protestant? Now, very, very selfish reasons that Henry becomes a Protestant. So let's have a look at what changed in the 1530s. So he had married Catherine of Aragon. Now, he wanted a son. And unfortunately, Catherine could only produce a girl who was Mary. And Henry said he thought God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Okay, so he thought he shouldn't have married her, he should have married somebody else, and it was her fault that he wasn't having a son. He wanted to end this marriage, okay, in a process that we know as divorce. Now, divorce was not allowed under the Catholic Church. Okay, it was illegal. You weren't allowed to get divorced under the Catholic Church. So he asked the Pope for an annulment, which means a cancellation of the marriage. He said, look, I should never have married this woman. I want you to cancel the marriage and then God will forgive me. However, the Pope said absolutely not, and said no, he wouldn't let Henry divorce Catherine. Henry wanted to divorce Catherine so that he could marry his next wife, which he does, which is Anne Boleyn. Okay, so his primary reason, the main reason for Henry wanting to get to carry out the Reformation, to leave the Catholic Church, was so that he could divorce Catherine of Aragon, or leave Catherine of Aragon, and go on to marry Anne Boleyn. Okay, because he wanted a son to produce an heir. Now let's have a look at a few more reasons. So there's Henry in the middle, looking happy as ever. And there's a few more reasons here why he wanted to get rid of the Catholic Church. So we've already said he wants a son. He's been married for 20 years. Catherine of Aragon is too old to have children now. Who's going to inherit his throne? Heaven forbid it was Mary, because Mary's a female. She can't rule the country. Okay, he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. Will the Pope give me an annulment? The answer is no, he won't. He says, you've sworn in front of God that you're going to marry and love this woman, and that's exactly what you're going to do. Okay, now we're going back to our point before. The church is very rich. If he can get his hands on the money, he can spend it on himself, on his court, and he does exactly that, because the money stops going to the Pope and starts coming to Henry. Okay. Princes are reforming their churches in Germany, where the Reformation was started, and other people are throwing out the Catholic Church. So does he want to be behind the times, or does he want to be keeping up with these other princes in Europe? Okay, he wants to be with the times, Henry. Some people in England like the new Protestant ideas. They believe that the Bible should be in English and not Latin. So he thinks that his people are going to be happy with these changes. Okay, they're going to be satisfied if he changes the church to the Protestant religion. And the church takes money out of my country in taxes to help build St. Peter's in Rome. What do I get in return? Now I'm going to circle this bit. This is always Henry's question. What do I get in return? What is he getting from the church? Because as far as he can see, all it's doing is making sure he doesn't get married, stopping him from having a son, and taking his money and using it in Rome when he could be using it in his own country. Now, there are advantages to the English people, like we've said, church services and the Bible being in English and not in Latin. And the fact that they can then understand the services, but everything else on here is to do with Henry, okay, and his own wants and, you might say, needs. Okay, so there's a number of different reasons here, but this has a massive impact on the people. Now, not only on the people, but on the church itself. So what Henry does is he gets rid of all of the Catholic churches. He splits up the land from the church and sells it off, so he gets all of that. And he gets rid of the monks and the nuns who had been in the Catholic Church in a process called the dissolution of the monasteries. Okay, you might want to go away and look that up. I haven't got time to talk about it in any detail in this video, but the dissolution of the monasteries was absolutely horrific. There was a lot of stealing, a lot of burning down these monasteries and taking the riches from the church and then selling them. You can still see ruins of monasteries in our country after this happened. So it's not a peaceful process, pardon me. It's not a peaceful process, the Reformation. Not everybody is happy with it. And we'll just have a quick look at what Henry actually does at the end. So he makes himself the supreme head of the new Church of England. Okay, so you may see it referred to as the Church of England. You may see it referred to as the Church of England. It's the Protestant Church. Okay, the Church of England is the Protestant Church. He rid himself of his old Catholic Archbishop Wolsey, and he appoints a new Protestant archbishop called Thomas Cranmer. Okay, so he gets rid of the people who were advising him in the church and who were representing in the church, and he brings new people in who agree with the way that he wants to run things. He annulled his own marriage. Okay, this is an important point. Now, he doesn't need to go to the Pope. He doesn't need to say, can I divorce my wife? He does it himself. He said, look, I'm the head of my new church, and under my rules, I can get rid of my own wife. So he is successful in his bid to get rid of Catherine of Aragon, and he marries Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant. That's naughty, not Henry. He hoped with a son. Now, we know that this isn't the case. She is actually pregnant with Elizabeth I. He bullied anyone who opposed his break from the Catholic Church, even executing men who he had previously trusted. Now, this execution of people during the Reformation and going forward, we'll see quite a lot. The religious turmoil, the religious arguments in England do last a very, very long time, and there's a lot of death because of the Reformation and what happens after it. Okay, so he closes all of the monasteries and the nunneries in England, and he took over all of their lands and wealth. So he can use this money in his own court, he can use it on himself, but he can also use the land to reward people for being loyal to him. So if somebody in his court is in favour, he can say, look, you do this for me and I will reward you this land. So what it does, in summary, the Reformation makes Henry VIII much more powerful. Okay, he has a lot more land, he has a lot more wealth, he has a lot more control over what happens to the church and himself as ruler and what he can and can't do. He is only now answerable to himself. So he is now, it now goes God, Henry. Okay, there's no one in between, there's nobody blocking his power. So it's a really, really important turning point in history. And if you tune in for the next video, we will be going through what happens when Henry dies and when Edward takes over. But again, what I will say about Henry is he's quite a hypocrite, because he does actually himself remain a Catholic in his worship and the way that he worships God and the way that he still attends mass. So he changes the churches, but not too dramatically, because his belief doesn't change. He only does it for practical reasons for himself, not because his beliefs have changed. That is very different for his son, who we will discuss in the next video. So thank you very much for joining me for this one. Hopefully you've gained a really good insight into what the Reformation was. Now let's go and have a look at what the consequences were. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you in the next video.